Hey everyone. Today I'm going to cover the different distinctions like the real distinction, virtual distinction, and formal distinction in the scholastics. For now, I'm not going to touch on any other distinctions because I want to keep this video shorter, and the modal distinction and adequate distinction, for example, require a lot of explanation, especially because they're pretty similar to the formal distinction, at least from my understanding. Overall, this is a pretty tricky topic to understand because you'll see a lot of different scholastic thinkers use the same phrases or terms with slightly different meanings. So usually you have to go through some secondary sources to actually understand what they say. I'm mostly going to be touching on Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus, but I might talk about some other writers where it's fitting. Anyway, I'm going to refer to some sources as well today because this is pretty complex. I'll link them for purchase or download in the notes today. I'm mostly going to be drawing on Ed Feser's Scholastic Metaphysics and various works from Allan Wolter. The former, Ed Feser, is a Thomist, and the latter, Allan Wolter, was a Scotist, but they're surely helpful on both sides here. So before we begin, I think it's also valuable to discuss why distinctions are valuable. One of the best things about the scholastic method is its precision, at least when understood. Unfortunately, some scholastics are particularly confusing or hard to read, but when understood, they're very succinct and helpful. This holds regarding the various distinctions as well. It's simply helpful to have a terminology that lets us distinguish between the difference between, say, the sun and the moon, or the difference between my will and my intellect, without simply defaulting to, they're just different, or using long-winded phrases to describe such. Now, with that said, let's begin with the real distinction. The real distinction can be very broad or narrow depending on the scholastic whom you're reading. However, across pretty much every scholastic, the real distinction is one that reflects a difference in a reality that is beyond the mind. So the distinction is something in reality apart from the act of the intellect. In the Thomistic system, there's the major real distinction, which is a distinction between entities, and those entities can be of different types. This can also be the distinction found between different parts of an object or between different accidents in an object. Meanwhile, the Thomists also have the minor real distinction, which is a distinction that's between a thing and its modes, like the distinction between an object and its location. What's really important is that for the Thomists, separability is not a necessary aspect of the real distinction. Two entities, X and Y, can be really distinct without being separable. Now, Scotists wouldn't say this. Scotists would say that the real distinction does entail separability. So if you have a real distinction in the Scotian system, the entities in question are separable. Allan Wolter, summarizing Scotus, says, quote, "The sign of a real distinction is separability or actual separation," end quote. He gives the body and soul as an example. So continuing with this thought, Scotus would say that two distinct but inseparable things are actually formally distinct, but Aquinas would say that they're really distinct. Honestly, as Feser says, a lot of this issue is just one of categorization. Thomas's real distinction arguably includes the formal distinction that Scotus has in mind, so it's not always the case that Thomas and Scotus mean different things when Thomas says that something is really distinct and Scotus says that something is formally distinct. It's that they're using different categories to honestly describe the same thing. Wolter agrees with that sentiment. I should say that I'm personally more of a fan of the Scotian system on this because I think his additional category is more helpful than lumping in a lot with the real distinction. But that's neither here nor there for the sake of this video. The formal distinction itself is admittedly pretty confusing. It's taken me a few years to understand it, and I'm still learning about it practically every day. I'm going to read Allan Wolter on this one because he describes it better than anyone else I've read. Quote, "A distinction is formal, according to Scotists and others, if it exists between realities and formalities. For example, between the soul and its faculties, between the faculties themselves, between the metaphysical essence and its properties. A formality is something positive included in a real being which, although it does not and cannot exist by itself, can be conceived in a clear and distinct concept in abstraction from any other formality of the same thing that it belongs to. The sign of a formal distinction includes three things. A, the ability to be conceived in a concept that is not only distinct, but also complete and exclusive. B, such that what is conceived and is not a thing, but something of a thing. And C, inseparability, from which the thing it belongs to." End quote. So obviously there's a lot there. Basically, we have a formal distinction when we can conceive of a concept that is complete and exclusive in a subject, but it cannot exist apart from the subject in which it adheres or any other formalities in that subject. To quote Wolter once more, a formal distinction is, quote, "a distinction in the nature of the thing that comes between several formalities identified in reality, one of which can be conceived without the other before any work of the intellect, although it cannot exist without the other, even by divine power," end quote. So the formal distinction is technically before the operation of the intellect, but the act of separation is intellectual. I want to reiterate that this may seem really confusing and complex, and that's totally okay. Occam famously thought it was so mysterious, just as mysterious as the Trinity, in fact, that he'd only apply it to the Trinity. he wouldn't apply it to the distinctions in creatures, nor in the distinction between God's attributes. So don't feel bad if this is hard to understand, but I hope it helps a little, and I'd recommend reading the sources that I'll link below. Anyway, moving on to less controversial matters, the virtual distinction is effectively a distinction that occurs after some work of the mind. This is the distinction that we find between concepts of the same reality, something usually caused by a limitation in the intellect. As opposed to the formal distinction or some of the weaker forms of the Thomas real distinction, the virtual distinction is a set of incomplete concepts such that they're partial but inconclusive about the subject in question. As Wolter says, this distinction can have a foundation in the entity in question, like the diversity of effects flowing from a single cause. He gives the example of the sun illuminating, heating, and liquefying. There's also the distinction that arises without a foundation in the thing, like distinguishing between, quote, man and humanity, unquote. There may be a linguistic convention or easier ways for us to parse out one and the same thing. Anyway, I hope this short video was helpful. It's an important discussion that has far-reaching effects. It may have sounded like there isn't much of a disagreement between Thomas and Scotists on these matters beyond categorization, but there are significant differences at the end of the day. This is especially evident in the different methods of handling divine simplicity and the divine attributes. For example, Aquinas is willing to say that the attributes of God are virtually distinct from the divine essence and from each other, but that's largely because he affirms an analogy of being. Scotus will use the formal distinction much more, however, because he denies the analogy of being that Thomas uses. Both thinkers are trying to say that God is not composed of parts, yet he has multiple perfections the same way. There are also disagreements among the scholastics about the relation between essence and existence, the soul and its faculties, and more pretty interesting topics. Those all deserve their special attention, but I hope this sets a good background for everything. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you all later.